She didn't scream. She didn't beg. And she didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. When Claire Hartwell, 7 months pregnant, found her husband in bed with another woman, she quietly walked away carrying a secret USB drive she had been filling for 14 months. What was on it could destroy everything he thought he controlled. But the real shock wasn't the betrayal, it was what Claire had already prepared before he ever knew she was watching. This story reminds us that trusting your instincts is not weakness sometimes. It is survival. If Claire's journey touches your heart, please like, comment, share this story with someone who needs strength today, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about courage, dignity, and starting over. This content has been carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to bring meaningful reflection, emotional value, and life lessons to our audience.
She didn't scream, she didn't cry, and she certainly didn't slam a single door in a fit of rage. When Clara Hartwell stepped into her bedroom and caught her husband of 7 years in their bed with another woman, she did one thing that changed everything. She walked calmly to his office, knelt by the desk, and opened the bottom drawer. Her fingers found the USB drive she had been quietly filling for 14 months. It was a heavy metallic thing, holding years of secrets she was finally ready to use. Claire had known for a long time that something was wrong. Not every specific detail, but that persistent, low hum of dishonesty that women are so often told to ignore. People called it anxiety or hormones or just an overactive imagination. But Claire refused to push those feelings aside. She documented everything instead. Now, at 7 months pregnant, with nothing but a hospital bag, a road atlas, and a fire in her belly, she drove north into a Vermont snowstorm and simply disappeared. Danny Hartwell had money, expensive lawyers, and connections in every room that truly mattered. But what he didn't have was any clue what his wife had been building while he was busy underestimating her. Stay with us, because this story is going to surprise you. This is a journey about what happens when a woman stops waiting for someone else to rescue her and starts trusting the sharp, brilliant intelligence she was constantly told was nothing more than irrational paranoia. Whatever you are carrying quietly right now, know that this story is for you. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you own is what you chose to save before anyone else knew you were paying attention. If you are still here listening, you already know this story is different. Before we go any further, if something in Claire's experience feels familiar to you, if you have ever been made to doubt your own memory or your own instincts, leave a 1 in the comments. You don't have to explain your reasons. Just leave a 1, we see you. And we are going to keep going together if this story stays with you. Here is what we ask. It is not much, but it matters. Hit that like button. Not for us, but for every woman who needed to hear that trusting yourself is not paranoia, it is preparation. Leave a comment and tell us the exact moment you knew Claire was going to be okay. You can also tell us the moment you recognized a piece of your own story in hers. We read every single comment. Share this video with at least one person who needs to hear it today. You likely already know who that person is. And if you are new here, please subscribe. We tell stories like this every week, stories about real courage, quiet strength, and the extraordinary things that happen when women stop making themselves small to fit into someone else's life. We will see you in the next one. They say the moment your life changes forever is supposed to look just the way you imagined it. Claire Hartwell had imagined it 1,000 times. A sudden phone call with terrible news, a dark diagnosis delivered in a sterile office, a car accident on a slick Boston highway in November. She had played through these scenarios the way careful people do, privately, in that quiet space between sleeping and waking, as if rehearsing for disaster might soften the blow. She never imagined it would be a shoe, a single Italian loafer, size 11, lying on its side near the hallway baseboard. It looked like something dropped in a massive hurry, something discarded by a man who wasn't thinking about where his belongings landed because his mind was entirely occupied by something else. Claire stood in the doorway of their brownstone, her coat still buttoned, and looked down at that shoe for a very long moment. The world seemed to pause. She was 34 years old, 7 months pregnant, and she had just driven 40 minutes home from her OB appointment because her 2 o'clock meeting was canceled. She thought, she actually truly believed, that she might surprise Danny with dinner. She had stopped at that upscale Italian place on Newbury Street, feeling festive and tired, wanting to share a quiet evening at home before the baby arrived and changed everything they knew about their lives together. The bag of takeout was still in her left hand, warm with chicken piccata, his absolute favorite. She set the bag down on the cold marble counter. The kitchen was clean, but it was the kind of clean that felt forced and deliberate. She noticed the wine glasses next. 2 of them, rinsed and sitting upside down in the drying rack. Danny never rinsed wine glasses. That was a chore he had claimed he was far too busy for every single night for the last decade. In 11 years together, 7 of them married, she had never once seen Danny Hartwell rinse a wine glass. Something shifted deep in her chest. It wasn't the baby, it was something much colder. She noticed his tie draped haphazardly over the staircase banister. His jacket was folded carefully on the second step. A trail, she realized, a trail she was now following without ever consciously deciding to step into it. The silence in the house felt heavy, suffocating. The bedroom door was not closed all the way. Claire had been a high-powered corporate attorney for 6 years before she left the firm to support Danny's rapidly expanding real estate business. She had cross-examined seasoned witnesses. She had sat across the table from men twice her size who lied with extraordinary, practiced confidence. She knew exactly what the moment before knowing felt like. It was a physical sensation, a sudden sharpening of the air around her. She had felt it in courtrooms dozens of times. That specific, hollow quality of silence just before someone says the thing that cannot be unsaid. She pushed the door open with a gentle touch. The room was dim, with the late afternoon light pressing in around the edges of the curtains. And there in the bed, her bed, the one with the Belgian linen duvet she had ordered from a catalog and waited 6 weeks for, was her husband and a woman she had never seen in her life. She was young, with dark hair spread across Claire's pillow. Danny saw her first. His face went through 4 distinct expressions in under 2 seconds. Claire had time to count them because she wasn't moving. She was simply standing in the doorway, one hand resting on her stomach where her daughter was kicking, with the cheerful, sweet obliviousness of someone who did not yet know anything about the pain or the complexity of the world she was about to enter. Shock, calculation, performance, contrition. That was the order. Shock came first because he hadn't heard her come in. Calculation followed because Danny Hartwell's mind moved like a machine, and he was already running through damage control scenarios. Performance came third because the contrition that followed was clearly not real. She could see right through it, just like she had seen through his lies for the last year. She had always been able to see it, she realized. He said her name, but she turned away before he could finish the sentence. Her feet carried her to his home office at the end of the hall. Her hands were steady. She registered this fact distantly, the way you might notice a change in the weather. Her hands were completely, unnervingly steady as she sat down at his desk and opened the bottom drawer to find what she needed. Behind the thick stack of hanging files in the back left corner was a small, unassuming USB drive she had tucked away 14 months ago. She had begun saving things, bit by bit, for over a year. She wasn't entirely sure what she had been saving them for at the time. She told herself she was just being paranoid, being careful. She was a lawyer. After all, lawyers were trained to keep records, and that was all she was doing. It had nothing to do with the late nights, the new password on his phone, or the way he sometimes looked at her like she was a problem he was managing rather than a person he had chosen to love. The drive contained 2 years of financial records, screenshots of strange wire transfers, emails she had found and photographed, and recordings of conversations that proved he was emotionally manipulative. She had been building a case against her own marriage. She plugged the drive into his laptop, quickly added the last 3 months of files, ejected it, and slid it into the pocket of her maternity cardigan. From the bedroom came the sound of shifting clothes and his voice. low and urgent, speaking to someone who was definitely not Claire. She stood up, feeling a strange sense of clarity. She walked to their shared closet and pulled out the hospital bag she had packed at 30 weeks. Just like her doctor had suggested, it sat hidden behind her winter coats. She had told Danny she packed it, and he had simply nodded, preoccupied, and gone back to his phone. She picked up the bag, feeling the weight of it in her hand. She walked to the nightstand on her side of the bed, picking up her phone and her charger. Then, with a steady hand, she walked over to Danny's nightstand, opened the small drawer, and removed his Rolex watch with the worn leather strap. Her father had given that watch to Danny on their wedding day. Her father, who had passed away the following spring. The watch had come from his estate, and technically, legally, was hers. Danny appeared in the bedroom doorway just as she clicked the drawer shut. He was wearing his robe, his face settling into that rehearsed expression of contrition, trying hard to maintain the look. He pleaded, his voice cracking just a little, saying, "Claire, please, just listen to me for 1 minute." She looked at him once, a single, cold glance that stripped away any warmth he was used to. Then, without a word, she turned and walked past him, heading down the hallway. She walked right past his Italian loafer, which lay on its side by the baseboard like a discarded thought. She didn't slam the front door. Instead, she pulled it shut behind her with a small, precise, and final click. It was the absolute loudest sound she had ever made in her life. The cold November air rushed to meet her face, biting and sharp, and she stood on the brownstone steps for exactly 3 seconds just to catch her breath. Then she walked to her car, shoved the hospital bag into the back seat, and turned the key in the ignition. She managed to drive only 2 blocks before her hands began to tremble violently. She pulled into a gas station on Canal and sat there, the engine idling. Her phone was buzzing incessantly on the passenger seat, a frantic, vibrating mess of light and noise. The name Danny flashed on the screen over and over again. Demanding her attention, she turned the phone face down, silencing the ghost of her old life. She pressed her forehead against the cool, smooth leather of the steering wheel, trying to steady her racing heart. Her daughter kicked hard against her ribs, a sharp physical reminder that she was not alone. It felt as if the baby was saying, "I am here, I am still here." "Mom." Claire sat up straight and took a deep, shaky breath. She reached into the door pocket and pulled out the worn road atlas she always kept. It was an old habit from before the days of smartphones, a quirk that Danny had always made fun of, calling it archaic. She spread the map out across the steering wheel, the crinkled paper feeling solid under her shaking fingers. She traced Route 93 north out of Boston, watching as the line led into New Hampshire, and then finally into Vermont. Just north, just away. She had no concrete plan, but she had a thumb drive, a hospital bag, a map, and her father's watch. Her daughter was kicking with remarkable enthusiasm for someone whose world had just turned upside down. She thought, that will have to be enough. She pulled out of the gas station and headed north, leaving the city lights behind. The snow began to fall somewhere around Montpelier. It wasn't an aggressive, driving snow. Quiet, the kind that drifts straight down in the dark, as if the sky were simply shedding something it no longer needed to carry. Claire had been driving for 4 hours, and for the first time in many years, she felt like she could finally breathe, her lungs filling with air that didn't feel heavy with lies. She had pulled over just once to refuel, making sure to pay with cash, before eating a stale granola bar she found buried in the bottom of her bag. The baby was finally quiet, resting at last. The radio played a faded Carole King song on a signal that kept crackling and fading into static. She stumbled upon Mill Haven, Vermont, purely by chance. Route 2 East, the exit sign, completely unmarked and easy to miss. She took it simply because her back ached, her body screaming for a break. And the next town in her atlas was still 18 miles away. The road twisted through a dense thicket of dark pines, and then the trees abruptly fell away to reveal a main street lined with weathered, historic buildings. There was a cluttered hardware store, and a diner that glowed warmly against the freezing night. There was one single traffic light, one old stone church, and a pie shop with a hand-lettered sign pressed against the glass. Red, Marge's Pie and Coffee. Open late because Marge does not sleep anyway. The simple honesty of the sign made her feel like she had landed in another world. Claire pulled her car into the cramped gravel lot, sitting right beside the shop. She sat there in the dark for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. Through the foggy window, she watched a woman working behind the counter, silver-haired, moving with the rhythmic, practiced efficiency of someone who had occupied that same space for 30 years. She knew where every single object was without even looking. Claire stepped out. The freezing mountain air hit her like a physical weight, cold enough to reset her mind. This was Vermont cold, a totally different beast than the shallow, biting cold she knew back in Boston. Boston cold feels rude and intrusive. Vermont cold is just honest, stripping everything back to the bone. She pushed the door open and a bell chimed high above her head. A wave of dry, intense warmth rushed out to greet her, carrying the thick, comforting scent of butter, cinnamon, and roasting coffee. It caught her off guard, making her throat tighten in a way she never expected, bringing tears to her eyes that she quickly blinked away. It smelled exactly like her grandmother's kitchen, a memory she had not thought about in years. The woman behind the counter looked up. She was in her late 60s, with silver hair pulled back by a clip featuring a small, plastic daisy. She wore a heavy flannel shirt and a faded apron with the word boss printed in bold, block letters. Her eyes were blue, sharp, and they took in Claire's entire situation without needing a single word of explanation. She was a woman who had seen a lot of life and didn't mind being blunt about it. The heavy, pregnant belly, the expensive city clothes, the telltale puffiness in her eyes proved she had been crying, even if Claire would have tried to deny it in 2 seconds flat. The woman said, "You look like you have had a long day." Claire managed to reply, "That is certainly one way to put it." The woman insisted, "Sit down. I will get you some decaf." Claire said, "I do not need," but she was cut off. "Sit down, honey," the woman ordered. "Your feet are swollen, and you have been driving through heavy snow. Just sit." Claire finally sat. The counter stool was old, covered in red vinyl, and slightly cracked along the side. She folded her trembling hands around the steaming coffee mug the woman set in front of her, feeling some cold, locked thing deep in her chest begin to slightly loosen. "I am Marge," the woman said. "This is my place." She didn't offer a last name or ask for one, which felt like a strange, rare kindness. "You need pie," Claire shook her head, saying, "I am not really hungry." Marge replied. That was not a question. She was already slicing a piece of something golden and fragrant, apple with a sharp cheddar crust. She set it on the counter with a fork. "You from Boston?" Claire looked up, stunned. "How did you know?" "Your coat," Marge said. "Nobody in Vermont buys a coat that color." It was a simple observation that made Claire feel seen in a way that had nothing to do with her status or her past. "Where are you headed?" "I'm not sure yet." Marge looked at her steadily. "Running from something or running to something?" "I am not running," Claire said. Then, after a long pause, she added, "I am relocating spontaneously." Marge made a sound that might have been a laugh. "That is the most lawyer-like answer I have ever heard, and I have lived next to an attorney for 20 years. Eat your pie." The woman was sharp, quick-witted, and refused to let Claire hide behind her usual polished, evasive answers. Claire ate the pie. It was objectively the best thing she had eaten in recent memory, despite having dined at some of the most expensive restaurants in the country. The bell above the door chimed again. A man stepped inside, stamping snow off his heavy work boots. He was tall, lean, wearing a dark flannel jacket with a volunteer fire department patch on the sleeve, and dark hair graying at the temples. He brought a gust of cold air and the smell of pine and gasoline with him. He was carrying 2 overflowing paper bags from what looked like a hardware store. He stopped dead when he saw Claire, looked at his mother, then back at Claire, and then back at his mother again. Marge said, "Connor, this is..." She looked at Claire. Claire said, "This is Claire. She is relocating spontaneously. Set those bags down and get yourself some coffee." The ease with which Marge introduced her was startling, as if she were already part of the shop's quiet, predictable rhythm. Connor Kowalski set the bags on the floor, poured himself a cup of coffee. and sat 2 stools away from Claire. He moved with the careful body language of a man who was not entirely sure what was happening, but had enough common sense not to ask too many prying questions. He had gray-green eyes and hands that were clearly used to actual hard labor. He looked like the kind of man who fixed things for a living, someone steady and reliable in a world that felt like it was spinning. He said, "Snowing pretty good out there." "Yes," Claire replied, "road okay coming in. I slid a little on that curve near the exit." "Yeah, that curve is bad. The town has been arguing about putting up a warning sign for 11 years. He drank his coffee. They will probably get around to it. Something about his complete lack of performative charm, no attempt to be interesting, struck her as the most restful thing she had encountered in a long time. It was honest, simple conversation. Marge appeared from the back with a fresh pot of coffee and a look on her face that Claire would soon recognize as the expression she wore when she was deciding someone else's fate. "I have got a room above the shop," Marge said. "My husband passed 3 years ago. Nobody is using it. It smells like Old Spice and 40 years of unprocessed feelings. But it has a good bed, a private bathroom, and a lock on the door. It was an offer as direct and practical as a hammer." Claire said, "I could not possibly impose." "You are not imposing. I am offering. There is a difference." Marge poured coffee with the finality of someone who had already made up their mind. $600 a month, utilities included. No drama. Claire almost laughed at the simplicity of it. "Can pay 3 months up front," she said, thinking of the secret savings account she had opened 18 months ago, quietly, in her own name, a nest egg she had hoped she would never truly need. She had been moving money into that account slowly, bit by bit, a secret shield against an uncertain future. She had always told herself she was just being paranoid, but she was profoundly grateful now for that foresight. Everything began to settle into place. Marge said, "Connor, take her bag up the back stairs." Connor stood without a single comment and picked up the heavy hospital bag from where Claire had set it by the door, never asking why she had it. He carried it toward the back of the shop. He did not make a production of it, which she appreciated more than she could say. Claire sat at the counter for another moment in silence. She pulled out her phone and checked the screen. 22 missed calls, 14 texts. She did not bother reading any of them. She opened her banking app and confirmed the balance in her personal account. It was enough for now. It was enough for her to start over. She thought about what a therapist she had seen briefly 3 years ago had said about the moment before a person finally changes their life. She had said, "It rarely feels like courage. It mostly feels like an exhaustion that has finally run out of other alternatives." Claire put her phone face down on the counter, ending the tether to her past. She looked at Marge, who was wiping down the machine with the focused attention of someone giving her privacy. She murmured, "The pie really is exceptional." Marge did not even look up from her work, her hands dusting flour off the counter with a practiced, rhythmic motion. "I know it is." "Honey," she replied without missing a beat, "I have been baking this exact recipe for 40 years now." The space above the shop was small, cozy, and carried that distinct, comforting scent of nutmeg, cloves, and home. A handmade quilt was folded neatly at the foot of the bed. A braided rug lay on the worn floorboards, and a window looked out over the snowy, quiet alleyway behind the building, where a woodpile stood like a silent sentinel against the winter cold. There was a bathroom featuring a heavy clawfoot tub, which Claire decided then and there would become her personal sanctuary every single day. She did not sleep well that first night in her new surroundings. The baby shifted constantly, restless and active, and Claire lay on her side with one hand pressed firmly against her stomach. She spent hours listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a small town settling into the quiet of the night. There was no traffic hum, no vibrating bass from the apartment below, and most importantly, no dreaded sound of a phone buzzing on a nightstand that usually signaled another demand from the life she had just escaped. When morning arrived, she sat at the small desk positioned by the window and clicked open her laptop. She knew she had to fully understand the weight of what she was carrying with her. The small silver drive contained 2 years of meticulous, exhausting documentation. She had begun saving these details the winter before last, starting on a night when Danny had spoken to her for 40 minutes in a voice so calm it felt surgical. He had spent that time explaining exactly why she had misremembered a past conversation and why her version of reality was emotionally colored, effectively rewriting her own history right in front of her. He had pulled this manipulative trick many times before. He would present her own memories back to her, shifted and altered just enough to create doubt, until she genuinely felt like she could not trust her own mind. She had sat in the dark with that sickening, hollow feeling afterward and told herself, I need to start writing these things down. So she had compiled a secret document with exact dates and timestamps, saved screenshots of texts, and preserved 3 recorded conversations. Because she was a trained lawyer who knew the critical difference between being paranoid and being properly prepared. And then, about 8 months ago, she had stumbled upon the financial documents that changed everything. She had been searching for a simple receipt for a dishwasher repair, which Danny had claimed was filed safely in his home office. She found the receipt, but she also discovered a folder she did not recognize tucked away in the back of the drawer. Inside were wire transfer confirmations for an account she had never seen before, totaling $900,000 moved over the course of 18 months. It was a massive amount of money. The paper trail was damning evidence of a life built on shadows. She had carefully photographed every single page and replaced the folder exactly as she had found it, ensuring no dust was disturbed. She had sat perfectly still in Danny's leather office chair for a long time, letting the reality wash over her. Then she had simply gotten up, gone to the kitchen, made dinner, and said nothing at all. Now, sitting in the room above the pie shop, she opened the digital files and went through them systematically. The wire transfers, the emails between Danny and a man named Gerald Ford, who was a high-level zoning official for the city of Boston, all painted a very clear, very illegal picture. The emails were written to be careful, but they were not nearly careful enough to fool a professional. A good lawyer could read between the lines easily. A prosecutor certainly could. She opened a fresh document and began drafting a summary that was clear, precise, and organized, just like the complex case briefs she had written throughout her career. She was so deep in her work that she did not hear the knock at first. Claire, Marge's voice drifted through the door. Breakfast is ready down here if you want it, she called out, sounding genuinely kind. And there is someone on the phone downstairs who says she is your sister, Marge added. Claire went completely, deathly still. She had called her sister, Rebecca, from the road late the night before and left a frantic, brief voicemail. She had said only, I am okay, I am somewhere safe. I will explain everything soon. She hurried downstairs. Rebecca's voice on the landline was tight with the sharp, jagged tension of someone who had been up all night, pacing the floor, worrying about her loved one. Claire, what on earth is going on? Danny reached out to me at 6 this morning, sounding absolutely panicked. He claimed you had some kind of total breakdown and just walked out on him. He is worried sick, Claire. Where are you right now? Claire gripped the receiver, her knuckles turning white. I did not have a breakdown, she replied, her voice cold and steady, cutting through the static. I came home early, Rebecca. I walked through my own front door and found him in bed with another woman. Silence stretched across the line, heavy and suffocating. Rebecca, I am safe and I am here. After a long, ragged exhale, Becca whispered, Oh, Claire, listen, I have proof of financial misconduct, too. I am already working with a lawyer. I plan to reach out to them today. I need you to promise me something. Rebecca, do not tell Danny where I am. You have to keep this between us. Of course, I promise. I will not say a word. I swear it. Rebecca paused, then added, Claire, there is more. He called Jennifer, too. Claire felt her hand tighten around the plastic phone until it hurt. Jennifer Marsh had been her closest friend since their days in law school. They had stood by each other in weddings, shared every secret. Jennifer knew about the financial documents. She knew enough to understand the gravity of what was happening. Claire had let a bit too much slip one night after a few glasses of wine. She had poured her heart out about the strange financial discrepancies she had uncovered. "What exactly did he tell Jennifer?" Claire asked, her throat feeling tight and constricted. "He told her you were suffering from a severe mental health crisis," Rebecca explained. "He claimed the pregnancy had made you completely unstable. He said he was desperately worried about the baby, and he needed to know if Jennifer had noticed any concerning behavior lately." The room went deathly quiet. Claire could hear nothing but the faint sound of her own breathing, a stark contrast to the betrayal settling deep in her bones. "He is building a narrative," Claire said, speaking more to herself than to the person on the other end. "What do you mean?" "He is already crafting his story," she repeated. "Before I have even hired an attorney, he is framing me for a breakdown." She pressed her hand firmly against her stomach, feeling the baby move. This child was listening, too. "I need you to trust me." "Rebecca, I was not having a crisis. I was having a completely rational response to an entirely rational set of facts." "I know, honey. I know you are right to be angry, but you must stay focused. Do not let him rattle you. You are stronger than this, and you are not alone in this fight. I know what I have to do. Please do not contact him. Do not tell him anything about this call or where I might be. Claire, where are you?" Really, she looked out the window of the small shop into the quiet, frozen Vermont morning. The snow sat heavy on the window boxes, and a cardinal perched on the fence, a bright splash of red against the gray. Connor Kowalski's old truck was just pulling out of the alley, loaded down with a fresh delivery of firewood. "Somewhere I can finally think," she said. "I am somewhere safe, and I am finally starting to see the path forward. Do not worry about me. Rebecca, I am going to win this." After she hung up the phone, she sat at the wooden counter, feeling a strange, sharp sense of clarity. Marge walked over and set a warm plate of eggs in front of her without a single word of judgment. "My husband," Claire said, staring at the steam rising from her plate, "is going to try to convince everyone I am unstable." Marge pulled up a stool on the other side of the counter and sat down, leaning in close. "And are you unstable?" she asked directly. "No," Claire said. "Then that is going to be a very hard case for him to make," Marge replied firmly. She poured 2 cups of coffee, the smell filling the small room, grounding Claire in the present moment. "What are you planning to do about it?" Marge asked, her eyes searching Claire's face. Claire looked down at her eggs, then back up at Marge. "I need to find an attorney. A good one, someone who does not know my husband at all." Marge nodded slowly. "My son knows a woman in Burlington, Diane Fletcher. She handled his divorce a few years back, and she is brilliant." Marge took a sip of her coffee and added, "She is like a very well-dressed Rottweiler. She will not stop until she gets what you need." "That is exactly the kind of representation I need," Claire said, feeling a sudden, genuine flicker of hope. "That is exactly what I need," Claire said with resolve. Diane Fletcher's office occupied the top floor of a converted Victorian house on Church Street in Burlington. Connor had driven Claire the hour south in his heavy truck, which carried the earthy scent of fresh sawdust and pine. He did not ask her to explain her complicated situation, and he did not offer unwanted opinions. He simply drove with a quiet confidence that Claire found deeply reassuring. He understood the need for silence, and he respected her privacy in a way that felt like a lifeline. She watched the landscape shift, feeling a weight lift slightly from her shoulders with every mile they put between her and the life she left behind. He listened to a local country radio station at a low, steady volume. Once, when the roads got slick while passing through Waterbury, he calmly remarked, "Patch of black ice here," in the exact same tone he might use to say the coffee was ready. Claire sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the scenery. Lake Champlain began to appear between the rolling hills, and for the first time in months, she felt like she could actually breathe. The world felt wider, bigger, and less defined by the trap her husband had constructed. She was no longer just the woman he wanted to paint as crazy. She was a woman with a plan, and she was moving forward. Diane Fletcher was 55, slim, wearing a sharp charcoal blazer and the calm expression of a woman who had seen everything and was startled by nothing. She shook Claire's hand with a firm, professional grip and gestured to a leather chair. "Tell me everything," she said. her eyes intense. "Start from the beginning and do not leave anything out, because I will figure out whatever you hide eventually. It is easier for both of us if I have the full picture now." Claire nodded and began to speak. She told her everything, from the first signs of the affair to the cold, calculated way her husband had started erasing her sanity. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder as I laid everything out for her, step by step, item by item. It took 45 minutes to show Diane the full scope of the wreckage, and she took notes in a rapid, precise hand without once interrupting my flow. When I finally finished, the silence hung heavy in the room. Diane leaned back, staring up at the ceiling tiles for a long, reflective moment before she shifted her gaze back to mine. "The wire transfers," she asked, her tone clinical. "Are you absolutely certain of the amounts?" I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Yes, $940,000 over 18 months. I have every confirmation number and the entire string of emails involving the local zoning official. There are 17 in total. I even have high-resolution screenshots of every single one. I am not imagining this, Diane. It is right there in black and white, waiting to be used to expose him for exactly who he is. I have screenshots of every single one of them," I repeated, needing her to understand the weight of the evidence I held. Diane nodded slowly, her expression unreadable but intensely focused on the details I had laid bare. "Claire, listen to me very carefully," she said, her voice dropping into a serious register. "This is no longer just a standard divorce case. What you have sitting on that drive could easily result in serious federal charges against your husband. We are talking about wire fraud, tax evasion, potentially bribery of a public official. I know you understand that he will fight with everything he has to discredit you and cover his tracks. I know that too," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I am ready to do whatever it takes to ensure the truth comes out. I am not backing down. Not now, and certainly not after everything I have already gone through." Diane looked at me directly, her gaze unwavering and piercing. "Good," she said, "because the first thing he is going to do is attack your fitness as a mother. He will claim you have a long history of instability, that you abandoned the marital home, and he might even accuse you of stealing company documents just to frame him. He will try to turn this entire case into a discussion about your mental state rather than focusing on his criminal actions." I felt that familiar, icy chill settle in the center of my chest, but I did not flinch. I had anticipated this move. I knew his playbook better than anyone else on the planet, and I was prepared to fight back with cold, hard facts. If he wanted a battle, he was going to get one, and I had the ammunition to make sure he lost. "What do we do now?" I asked, needing a plan of action. "We document everything from this exact moment forward," Diane instructed. "Every phone call, every text, every unsolicited contact from him or his representatives. We must establish your mental stability proactively before he has a chance to frame the narrative. That means I want you seeing a therapist immediately, not because you need it, but because I want a licensed professional on the record stating that you are a competent, stable, and caring mother." Diane raised a hand to silence my objection before I could even voice it. "Although, frankly, given what you have described, it would not hurt to have that support. We need to be airtight. Everything we do from here on out must serve the goal of proving your fitness as a parent and as a person." "Okay," I agreed, feeling the gears finally turning in our favor. "We file first, today if possible. I want our divorce petition in before he even knows what hit him. I want adultery on the record, emotional abuse on the record, and financial misconduct on the record." Diane picked up her pen, her movements sharp and precise. "He has been building his false narrative for 12 hours. We are going to start building ours right now, and ours will be built on the absolute truth." Connor was waiting in the hallway when I emerged from the office. He looked up from a 3-month-old copy of a magazine, his posture relaxed. "How did it go?" he asked. "She is going to file today," I told him, feeling a wave of relief. "It is all finally happening." "She called it financial misconduct, emotional abuse, and adultery," I said, feeling a surge of resolve that I had not felt in years. Connor stood up, his face becoming serious and attentive. "Does that cover everything?" he asked. I considered the list for a moment, thinking about the years of manipulation. "Yes, I think it covers it pretty thoroughly." We walked back to the truck in the biting, cold Burlington afternoon. I felt the small silver USB drive in my pocket, solid and feeling much heavier than something that size had any right to be. It was the key to my freedom, the weapon that would finally dismantle the cage he had built around my life. I was ready to use it, and for the first time, I felt like the hunter rather than the prey. I thought about what Diane had said about building a narrative, and I thought about the 14 months I had spent quietly, carefully building exactly that. I had not known at the time what I was building. I had thought I was being paranoid, just overthinking everything that Danny did. I was grateful now for that paranoia. It had saved me from a life of quiet erasure. The truck, halfway back to the quiet town of Millhaven, Connor said. "My ex-wife used to say I was incapable of talking about my feelings." It was a strange admission to make, but he said it with such casual honesty that I looked over at him, truly surprised by his sudden vulnerability. I looked at him, trying to gauge why he was sharing this with me. "Why are you telling me that?" I asked. He kept his eyes on the road, his grip firm and steady on the wheel. "Because you have been sitting there very quietly for about 20 minutes, and I think you might be stuck in your own head too much. The only way I know how to interrupt that is to say something unexpected." I looked at him, really looked at him, for another moment. He was rough around the edges. Yes, but he was grounded in a way my husband never was. I appreciated the bluntness of his approach. It was a refreshing, welcome change from the constant, manipulative mind games I had endured for so many years. Then I said, "Did she have a point?" "Your ex-wife, probably," he replied with a small, self-deprecating shrug. "I am better with working with lumber than with navigating complex emotions." There was a pause as the truck rumbled down the long, winding road, but I am working on it. Something about the complete plainness of this statement made me laugh. It was a real, genuine laugh, not the polite, social laugh I had deployed at cocktail parties for years to smooth things over. A real laugh surprised out of me, and it felt like the first piece of my old, authentic self finally returning to the surface. Connor glanced over briefly, and the corner of his mouth lifted in a rare, small smile. 3 weeks passed by in a blur. I settled into a new routine. I spent my mornings helping Marge in the shop, which I was initially terrible at in ways that Marge described with colorful, biting precision. My first attempt at a pie crust was characterized by Marge as geological, mostly because it was dense and nearly impossible to break. My second attempt was, according to Marge, an act of violence against pastry. I could not help but laugh at her brutal criticism. It was honest. It was not designed to manipulate me or make me feel small. It was just a pie. By the third week, I was producing something that Marge described as not embarrassing, which I understood to be high praise indeed. I saw a therapist named Dr. Walsh via video call twice a week. I slept better. I walked the snowy streets of Millhaven in the mornings, my breath making soft, white clouds in the cold air. I was healing, piece by piece. I was becoming someone else, someone stronger, someone who knew her own worth. I did not have to be the woman Danny wanted me to be anymore. I could just be myself, and that was enough for me for now. My daughter was kicking with consistent, rhythmic enthusiasm, a constant, beautiful reminder of the life I was protecting. I checked my phone once a day in the evenings for anything from Diane. I did not check it the evening the email arrived. I was asleep early, the deep, exhausted sleep of someone whose body is doing serious, important work. I did not see the notification until the next morning. It was an alert from Diane's office. My heart skipped a beat, but I forced myself to stay calm as I picked up the phone to see what news had arrived. It was a new legal filing from Danny S. high-priced attorney. I opened the document right there at the counter with my cup of decaf while Marge was busy in the back, and Connor was outside loading wood into the shed. I read the first paragraph. Then I read it again, very slowly. Then I set the phone face down on the counter and sat very still, trying to steady my breathing. Jennifer Marsh, an attorney at law and my best friend. had signed an affidavit on behalf of Daniel Hartwell's legal team. I felt the floor drop out from under me. In the document, Jennifer described observing her friend, Claire Hartwell, exhibiting what she called escalating emotional instability over the preceding 18 months. She described a specific incident at a restaurant where I had become, Jennifer's words, disproportionately upset over a minor slight. She went on to describe my behavior as paranoid and cited several private conversations in which I had expressed unfounded suspicions about my husband. It was a calculated, vicious lie, meant to destroy my credibility in the eyes of the court and the public. Jennifer, who had held my hand through 3 rounds of agonizing fertility treatments. Jennifer, who had sat at this very kitchen table metaphorically on a late-night phone call, listening while I whispered about the wire transfers I had found and swore her to secrecy. Jennifer, who now remembered those intimate conversations as evidence of my instability, rather than as the private confidences of a woman trying to understand something alarming and dangerous she had discovered about her life. Marge came out from the back with a tray of muffins and stopped dead when she saw the look on my face. She set the tray down on the counter and came around, pulling up the stool next to me. She did not say anything for a long moment, just waited for me to speak. "Jennifer," I said finally, my voice barely a whisper. "Your friend," Marge asked, keeping her voice low and steady. It was not a question. "My best friend," I repeated, my heart breaking all over again. I felt a profound sense of loss, but beneath it, the cold resolve I had cultivated began to harden. My voice was very steady. I was a lawyer, after all. I knew how to be steady when my insides were falling apart. She signed an affidavit for Danny's legal team, calling me unstable, describing incidents from our private conversations as evidence of paranoid behavior. Marge was quiet, letting the weight of the betrayal sink in. "He got to her first," I said, my eyes flashing with a new kind of fire. "He called her before I even had a lawyer, while I was still out on the highway, driving away. He did not just break my marriage. He stole my support system, one piece at a time." She pressed her hand flat against the worn countertop, the cool surface providing a small, grounding anchor in a world that felt like it was fracturing. He had been orchestrating this move for much longer than I had ever dared to suspect. Had she known about the evidence I kept hidden? The truth was, she knew I had discovered something significant about the finances. I had confessed it to her one rainy night, fueled by too much wine and an overwhelming sense of dread. Desperate for a confidant, Claire stared down at her silent phone. I shared it with her because she was my person, the one who held my life in her hands, because that is what you do when you trust someone with your soul. Marge gently placed her calloused hand over Claire's set trembling one. She leaned in close and said, "Baby, sometimes the person you think is yours is just someone who hasn't been tested by the fire yet." Claire looked up, searching her eyes. Marge continued, "The ones who truly hold up under the weight of pressure. Those are the real ones. You are currently finding out exactly which kind she was. It hurts like absolute hell. I know, but it is far better to know the truth now than to continue feeding that kind of person your most dangerous secrets." Connor arrived through the back door carrying a heavy armful of split wood, his eyes scanning the room in mere seconds. He sensed the tension instantly, set the wood down with practiced quiet, and began stacking it neatly by the fireplace without needing to be asked. Claire dialed Diane. Diane answered quickly, saying, "I saw the article. I am already working on it. Do you know if Jennifer received anything of value from your husband or his firm in the last few months?" "I honestly do not know," Claire replied, feeling the walls closing in. "I am going to find out," Diane said, her tone sharp enough to make Claire profoundly glad she was not Jennifer Marsh. "Listen to me, Claire. This is a painful setback, but it is not a fatal blow. His legal team is just trying to rattle you, so do not let them succeed." "I am not rattled," Claire lied. "Good," Diane replied, "because next week is going to be even harder. His team is filing for emergency custody on the grounds that you have abandoned the marital home and are now considered a flight risk. We are going to fight this every step of the way, but I need you to remain completely solid." Claire turned to look out the window at the snow-dusted street, the familiar hardware store across the way, and the lone cardinal perched on the fence post, a creature she had come to think of as a permanent, loyal resident. "I am solid," she whispered. She almost believed it herself. That night, she sat down and wrote in the leather-bound journal she had started keeping since the moment she arrived in Mill Haven. She poured her thoughts onto the pages, focusing on Jennifer and the agonizing cost of discovering that a person you once trusted implicitly had been converted into a weapon aimed directly at you. She wrote about the way betrayal from a dear friend cuts differently than betrayal from a husband. It is softer in some intimate ways because you love them so differently, yet it is somehow much harder in others for that exact same reason. She wrote, "The most dangerous thing I ever did was make myself small enough to fit into Danny's life. The second most dangerous was trusting the people he could easily reach." She closed the journal with a snap, pressing her hands firmly against her stomach. She felt her daughter shift and settle. "I know," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "Me too." The first major catastrophic event arrived on a Tuesday, a Boston gossip blog, the kind that thrived on documenting local wealth, real estate, and what they delicately labeled as domestic developments among the city's notable families. Published a piece titled, "Where is Claire Hartwell?" It described her as having fled the family home following what sources close to Daniel Hartwell described as a serious mental health episode. It specifically mentioned Vermont, though thankfully not Mill Haven by name. By the time Marge stumbled upon the article and showed it to Claire, there were already 347 comments. Claire read 12 of them before she had to stop. They painted her as unstable, ungrateful, a woman who had everything and threw a childish tantrum. Several strangers speculated about her unborn baby with a casual, cruel flippancy that made Claire's hands shake uncontrollably. The precious safety of being unknown, a feeling she had carried like a warm blanket since arriving in Mill Haven, dissolved in a single afternoon. She walked into the local pie shop later that day and found two women she recognized from the general store whispering near the front window. She knew then that Mill Haven was far too small and that being unknown was no longer an option. She told Marge the truth. Marge used a few colorful words to describe exactly what she thought of gossip blogs and the soulless people who wrote them. Then she looked at Claire and said, "You do not hide. You go about your daily business, and you let them stare all they want. People here know me. You are with me. That counts for something." It helped. It did not fix everything. Not by a long shot, but it certainly helped. The second catastrophic event happened on a Thursday. Claire was in the pie shop kitchen, attempting a large batch of snickerdoodles, a recipe she had chosen specifically because they were forgiving, and she desperately needed something that would not fail her today. She had been on her feet since 6 in the morning. Her back had been aching for 2 days. She had not slept a wink, and she had been trying as hard as she could not to think about the looming emergency custody filing. She dropped the heavy mixing bowl and instinctively reached for it. Suddenly, the entire room tilted sideways. She heard Marge's voice calling from very far away. She felt the cold floor slam against her knees. She thought, with terrifying clarity, "This cannot happen." Then her mind went blank. Connor was there. She was not certain how he appeared. One moment she was on the kitchen floor, and the next she was in the passenger seat of his truck, moving fast on a clear road, while he drove with one hand and talked on his phone with the other. "I am okay," she insisted. "You are not okay," he replied. "You passed out." "I did not pass out," Claire protested. His voice remained incredibly steady, the same calm tone he surely used at fire scenes. "You went down in the kitchen. I carried you out to the truck. We are 40 minutes from Burlington General, and I need you to stay awake for me." The baby began moving. That simple movement steadied her. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach, felt the life inside her, and breathed. Burlington General was a blur of a sterile room and a doctor with a kind face and a serious expression. It was a stress-related episode. The baby was perfectly okay. The baby's heart rate was strong. the doctor said with the specific, genuine admiration of a professional for something doing its job well under intense pressure. But Claire needed to drastically reduce her stress load, increase her rest, and eliminate, to whatever degree possible, the sources of her acute anxiety. Claire looked up at the flickering ceiling of the exam room. My primary source of acute anxiety, she said, is a 6'2" man with an 8-figure net worth and a very expensive, very vicious legal team. The doctor said gently, I will be sure to put that in the medical notes. She was left alone in the room for a long while before the nurse finally returned with the necessary discharge paperwork. She lay there and finally did the thing she had been refusing to do since the day she arrived in Vermont. She let herself be truly frightened, not for herself but for her daughter. That particular fear was completely different from any other anxiety she had ever known. It had no bottom to it. It just kept falling deeper and deeper. She was still caught in that dark fear when the nurse opened the door and said, Your friend is still waiting. If you want him to come in. The nurse added. Claire looked up. He is still here. He has not moved from the waiting room in 3 hours. She was quiet for a long moment, processing the weight of his loyalty. Yes, please send him in. Connor walked in holding a coffee from the hospital cafeteria in each hand, wearing the expression of a man who had been worrying hard but refused to make a dramatic production out of his concern. He handed her the coffee without a word and sat in the plastic chair by the bed. Is the baby okay? He asked. Yes, she replied. He nodded. Satisfied, they sat in the silence for a long time, and it was, she realized, the most comfortable, peaceful silence she had experienced in years. Danny's silences had always contained something hidden, a test, a judgment, or a cold expectation. Connor's silence was just pure, honest silence. He was simply there for her. The third catastrophic event happened on a Friday. Danny's car was a silver Mercedes that Claire recognized from 40 feet away. It pulled up in front of Marge's shop at 9 in the morning. He stepped out wearing an expensive gray cashmere coat and stood on the sidewalk of Mill Haven, Vermont, like a man who fully intended to be seen and noticed by everyone. He entered the shop carrying a large bouquet of flowers, bright yellow tulips. He handed them to Marge with a smile that had worked on almost everyone for most of his life. You must be Margaret. I am Danny Hartwell. I have heard wonderful things about this place. Marge took the flowers and set them on the counter without even looking at them. We are not open for another 20 minutes, she said flatly. I am just hoping to speak with my wife, he said with that practiced, oily smoothness he reserved for public spaces. Your wife, Marge replied, is not here. She stood firm behind the counter, her voice as flat as the countryside. This was technically the truth. Upstairs, Claire watched the silver sedan idling in the gravel. She was standing in the doorway to the back hallway, phone in hand, recording every word. Her heart was hammering, but not with simple fear. It was something much sharper and more dangerous. It was the icy, calculated clarity of a woman who had finally stopped running and started watching. It was the cold recognition of a pattern she had lived under for too long. He had finally tracked her down. The cryptic blog post had been the first calculated step, designed to rattle her nerves, and this public appearance was the second. He had been patient, which meant he had been planning this for weeks, mapping her movements. He settled into his charming persona, leaning against the counter to chat with 2 unsuspecting customers who had wandered in for coffee. He asked about the local weather, complimented the decor, and acted like a man without a care. He was always disturbingly good at this. He had always been exceptionally skilled at manipulating the people around him, wearing charm like a tailored suit. Connor walked through the back door, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He took in the entire scene in one sharp, experienced look. He stepped directly to the counter, positioning himself between the visitor and the back room. Sir, he said, his voice dropping into a low, warning register. We are not open yet. Can I help you with something? Danny looked at him with that specific, condescending assessment he usually reserved for people he deemed beneath him. It was a look so practiced and subtle that most people completely missed the cruelty behind it. I am just visiting my wife, Danny said, his eyes scanning the shop. Connor didn't blink. Your wife has a protective order filed in Suffolk County, he stated clearly. You might want to take a minute and think about the consequences before you continue this visit. That order is not yet finalized, Danny said, his charming smile staying perfectly in place as if he were discussing a business deal. So, technically, you are just in a small town in Vermont. Connor leaned in, his voice hardening like stone. Where my family has lived for 3 generations, and every single person in this room knows us. You really want to keep going with the technicalities? Danny looked at him for a long, silent moment, measuring the threat in Connor's posture. He calculated the odds and decided the game wasn't worth the immediate risk. Then he smiled even broader, a mask of false warmth, and said, "Just passing through, beautiful town." He nodded politely at Marge and turned, walking out into the daylight. Claire stayed hidden, her phone still recording every second. She heard his car start, the engine growling before it finally pulled away from the curb. She did not move for a long time, frozen by the sheer audacity of the encounter. That evening, she walked out to find her car with 2 slashed flat tires. It was a petty, vicious signature. She could not prove who had done it, just as she could not prove he had been watching her. She sat on the cold steps of the pie shop, her face buried in her hands. Marge sat down beside her, the night air biting and clear. The sky above Millhaven was dense with stars, uncaring and vast. Marge said, "I had a husband once who thought fear was a tool. He was not as rich as yours, not as polished, but he had those same hollow, predator eyes." Claire looked up, her voice trembling. "What did you do?" Marge let out a soft, dry laugh. "I built a pie shop that has been here for 32 years, and I raised a son who drove 90 miles per hour to Burlington on a Thursday morning without being asked." She paused, looking up at the stars as if reading a map. "People like that rely on you staying small. The thing about men like that is they operate on the currency of fear. They bank on your silence, your trembling, and the hope that you will shrink away into the shadows rather than face them down. The moment that fear evaporates, they are exposed as nothing more than bullies with hollow threats." Claire stood outside, looking up at the vast, uncaring expanse of the stars. In her coat pocket, the USB drive felt heavy, a cold anchor of evidence. She thought about Diane Fletcher back in Burlington, who was likely working late to build a case that would turn Danny Hartwell's worst nightmares into reality. "I am not afraid," she whispered. "I am determined." To an outsider, those 2 things might look the same, but the internal reality is worlds apart. Fear is a cage, but determination is a key. The settlement offer arrived on a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks after Claire had escaped Boston. Diane called at 8, her voice carrying that carefully managed, professional neutrality that signaled this was significant. The offer was staggering. Full custody of the baby would go to Claire. It was an opening salvo that made it clear how badly Danny wanted this to vanish, and how desperate he was to keep that drive hidden. The terms were generous to the point of absurdity. Permanent relocation rights meant she could build a life in Vermont, safe from the reach of the city. There were significant monthly support payments guaranteed for 18 years, a substantial lump sum for housing, and a clean, uncontested divorce. In exchange for this golden ticket, the financial documents sitting on that USB drive would be treated as confidential. No referrals to external authorities. It was a classic hush money move, wrapped in legal language, designed to trade a future of comfort for a past of unchecked corruption. Claire sat with a mug of black coffee at the counter in Margie's place. Marge had driven off to the wholesale market early, and Connor was out back, working on the repairs for a rotten floor joist. The sound of his hammer hitting wood was steady and rhythmic, a grounding beat in the middle of her chaos. She stared at the offer, weighing the cost of safety against the cost of silence. This meant her baby would be protected. It meant she would never have to walk into that hostile Boston courtroom, heavily pregnant and exhausted, to fight a battle she wasn't sure she could win. This settlement meant an end to the private investigators lurking in her peripheral vision. No more smear campaigns on gossip blogs. No more flat tires she couldn't prove he had slashed. It meant Danny would walk away clean from $900,000 in fraudulent transfers, from the illicit emails with Gerald Ford, the zoning official, and from every single detail she had spent 14 long months painstakingly documenting. She looked at the paper and asked Diane, "What is he protecting that is worth more than what he is offering?" There was a long, heavy silence. Then Diane spoke, her voice dropping into a sharper, more clinical register. "Now you are thinking like a lawyer. I have been thinking like that from the start." "What is it?" She explained that Gerald Ford, the city zoning official, was already under a separate, deep tissue investigation. It had nothing to do with them initially. The city ethics board had opened a formal complaint 3 months ago regarding questionable permits tied to a major development project in Charlestown. It was the kind of investigation that could bring down an entire municipal house of cards if the right thread was pulled. "Your documents," Diane continued, "would act as the primary corroborating evidence in that broader investigation." Diane paused, letting the weight of the information settle. "If Ford starts talking and evidence suggests he is already looking for a way out, your husband could be looking at serious federal charges. This divorce settlement is not a gift. It is containment. He is trying to buy your silence before Ford blows the whistle on everything." Claire closed her eyes, feeling the exhaustion deep in her bones. She wanted to say yes. The temptation to just take the money and be safe was overwhelming. She could feel the crushing weight of how much she wanted to say yes. The weeks of relentless stress, the fear, that terrifying hospital visit, the sabotaged tires, and the stinging betrayal from Jennifer, it all pressed against her like a physical weight. She was 8 months pregnant. She felt tired in a way that seemed to reach down into her very bone marrow. She thought about her unborn daughter. She thought about what she wanted her daughter to know about the world, and what a person should actually do when someone who hurt them offers a massive paycheck to bury the truth and walk away into the quiet. She took a steadying breath and said, "Add a permanent restraining order, and I want a written, on the record admission of the adultery and the pattern of emotional coercion. Not just in the divorce decree, I want it on the public record." Diane sighed. "He will not go for that." "Then we go to court," Claire replied. She pressed her hand flat on the wooden counter, grounding herself. "Diane, I used to be an attorney. I know exactly what a public record means. It means the next woman he does this to will have something to find when she starts looking for the truth about the man she is with." There was another long, tense pause. "Okay," Diane said finally. "I will communicate our position." That afternoon, Marge returned from the wholesale market. Connor finished his work on the joyist, and they sat down for soup. Marge shared a funny story about a customer who had once tried to return a pie 3 days after eating most of it, claiming it had been defective. It was the kind of simple, human moment that felt worlds away from the legal warfare she was orchestrating from her kitchen stool. It grounded her in a reality that felt far more permanent than Danny S. threats. Claire laughed until her stomach hurt, a genuine, cleansing kind of laughter. Connor, standing at the small sink washing bowls, spoke without turning around. "You made a decision today." "How do you know?" she asked. "You look different, lighter," he said. She considered his words for a moment. "I turned down a settlement offer." He turned around, wiping his hands on a towel. "That sounds like the opposite of lighter." "It is," she admitted, "and it isn't." It felt heavy because of the stakes, but light because she wasn't carrying the secret anymore. The truth was finally going to be out. She folded her hands on the cold granite of the counter, a calm settling over her that felt like armor. Danny was sitting there, his expensive suit looking out of place in such a modest diner, trying to buy my silence with promises that felt hollower than the air in the room. I had already decided that my dignity was not for sale at any price. Connor stood nearby, watching her for a long, searching moment. He did not say a word, just nodded once, gave a sharp, affirmative good, and turned back to his work of washing the heavy ceramic bowls, his movements steady and rhythmic. That night, the weight of the day began to lift as he found her in the small back garden, her face turned toward the vast, glittering expanse of the stars. The sky in Vermont felt infinite, clear and sharp in a way it never was beneath the heavy smog of Boston. Under that canopy, the city, Danny, and the looming court case suddenly felt small and manageable. He walked over and stood quietly beside her, holding out a mug of steaming tea. They stood in the stillness for a long time, the only sound the distant rustle of leaves. Finally he spoke, his voice low. "I do not say things like this very well," he admitted. She offered a faint, tired smile. "That is okay," she whispered. "My ex-husband used to say I communicated mostly in actions." "What actions do you want to take right now?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. He remained quiet for a while, letting the question hang in the cold air. Then he turned to her, his expression serious. "Whatever happens next, the court case, the baby, everything, you do not have to walk through this alone. I am here for all of it," he promised, his tone leaving absolutely no room for doubt or argument about his true intentions. She studied his profile in the shadows, struck by how strong and careful he appeared. "Connor, you know she isn't part of this," she said, referencing the situation. "I know," he replied, never taking his eyes off the stars above them. "I am here anyway. That is the whole point of this. That is actually the only point." Her throat tightened, a lump of emotion making it hard to speak. She looked away, blinking back the tears that suddenly stung her eyes. After a moment she managed a small, teasing laugh. "That is the most words you have said consecutively since I met you," she remarked. "Don't get used to it," he said, and for the first time, a small knowing smile played on his lips, softening the hard edges of his face in the moonlight. "I peeked," she laughed softly, feeling the tension evaporate into the night air. He smiled back, and somewhere in that crisp Vermont atmosphere, between the biting cold, the brilliant stars, and the rising steam from their mugs, something deep inside them shifted, like a heavy key finally turning in a long-stuck lock. The news came out of nowhere on a Sunday. Claire was in her small apartment, carefully folding the tiny baby clothes that Marge had brought back from a local church sale. They were delicate things, soft in shades of yellow and white, symbols of the future she was fighting with everything she had to protect. She was distracted by the simple, domestic task when her phone began to vibrate, shattering the quiet peace of the afternoon and changing the entire trajectory of her life. The phone rang, displaying an unknown number with a Boston area code. She answered it immediately, just as Diane had instructed, knowing every detail needed to be documented for the lawyers. "Claire," a woman's voice said. She sounded older, cautious, and incredibly careful. "This is Sandra Hartwell." Claire sat down abruptly on the edge of her bed, her breath catching. Danny's mother. If she had ever imagined hearing from Sandra, she would have expected anger, blame, or the stinging, protective fury of a mother whose son was under legal fire. She had braced herself for a confrontation, for someone to defend the man who had turned her world upside down. But the reality of the situation was already beginning to feel entirely different than anything she had prepared for. She had spent hours rehearsing a cold, professional response to any potential attacks. She was absolutely not prepared for what Sandra actually said next. "I know you do not have any reason to trust me," Sandra began, her voice steady. "I am not asking you to trust me. I am asking you to listen for 3 minutes." Claire said nothing, her thumb trembling as she reached out to press the record button on her phone. "Heart hammering," Sandra continued, her tone grave, revealing there was another woman before her. It was a detail Danny had kept buried deep, a hidden truth that was about to blow the lid off the carefully constructed life he had presented to the world. And Claire realized in that moment that everything she knew was a lie. Danny's first marriage was a secret he guarded jealously. "I do not know how much you know about it," Sandra admitted. Claire did know that Danny had been married briefly in his youth, but he had dismissed it as a regrettable, youthful mistake that ended quickly. He had been intentionally vague, using the same dismissive tone he used for anything he did not want anyone to look at too closely. "Her name is Patricia," Sandra said, her voice strained. She signed a non-disclosure agreement as part of their divorce settlement. The weight of that revelation hit Claire hard, knowing exactly how much power Danny wielded through his money and his ability to silence those who knew the truth about his private, dark nature. She received a large sum of money and she went away, and she was not allowed to describe what had actually happened to her during that marriage. A long, heavy pause hung in the air between them. "I have letters Danny wrote during that time," Sandra whispered. "I kept them because I was afraid. I told myself I kept them for no reason at all, but I was lying to myself every single day." Claire pressed her free hand flat against her knee, trying to force herself to stay composed as the gravity of the situation sank in. She realized that she had been holding on to evidence of a pattern that Danny thought he had erased from history forever, a pattern that would now become her lifeline. "He said the exact same things about Patricia that he is saying about you," Sandra said, her voice remaining unnervingly controlled. It was the cadence of someone who had been carrying a heavy, poisonous truth for a long time. He called her unstable, paranoid, and emotionally compromised, just like he is doing to you. He had people who said those same things for him back then, too, painting her as the villain. "Claire, I should have stopped it the first time. I didn't." She spoke with a deep, lingering regret that made it clear she had spent years haunted by the consequences of her silence. A silence that she was now finally ready to break before it was far too late for anyone else. "I believed him over her because he was my son, and it was easier to believe him," she confessed. Another long pause followed. "I cannot do it again." Claire's heart was hitting her ribs like a trapped bird. "What are you offering?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. Even to her own ears, she had been a lawyer, and she knew exactly when a case was turning. "Patricia's phone number, the letters, and my testimony if your attorney believes it would be useful to your side," Sandra replied. The offer was everything Claire needed, the missing pieces of a puzzle she thought she would never be able to complete, and it changed the entire balance of power for her future. Claire thought about what this revelation meant for Danny's entire, carefully constructed narrative. The image of the devoted husband dealing with a mentally unstable wife was crumbling from its own foundation right before her eyes. A judge was going to hear not just about one woman's alleged instability, but about a clear, deliberate, and repeated pattern with different women over the years. It was the same strategy, the same cruel words, played out on a loop to ensure he always remained the victim. She felt a surge of hope, knowing that for the first time, she had the evidence to prove that this was not a one-time misunderstanding, but a calculated form of psychological warfare that he had perfected over a decade of manipulation. She thought about Patricia, whoever she was, who had signed a legal document and vanished into thin air, never able to tell her story to the world. She said, "Sandra, why now?" A very long pause followed before the answer finally came through the phone. "I have a granddaughter coming," Sandra said, her voice cracking. "I want to be someone she can be told about." Claire sat in the tiny Vermont apartment, the baby clothes still in her lap, phone pressed tightly to her ear, breathing very carefully to avoid missing a single word. She felt the weight of those clothes in her lap shift from a burden to a purpose, realizing that she was not just fighting for herself anymore, but for the legacy of the child she was preparing to bring into this world. Then she said, "I am going to give you my attorney's number." The Boston courthouse on a gray November morning was bitter cold. Claire walked up the stone steps in a simple navy maternity dress that she and Marge had chosen together for the occasion. She was deliberate and measured in her movements, ensuring nothing about her could be described as dramatic or erratic. Her hair was down, and she wore her grandmother's pearl earrings, a symbol of grace and strength. She felt prepared for the challenge, knowing that every move she made would be scrutinized, so she carried herself with a quiet, unwavering dignity that demanded respect even before she stepped foot into the room where her entire future would be decided by a stranger in a robe. She was 8.5 months pregnant. She walked up those stone steps with the posture of someone who had absolutely nothing to apologize for, because she truly did not. Diane was right beside her, a pillar of support. Connor was right behind her in a dark jacket he had clearly borrowed for the day. It did not quite fit across his broad shoulders. His expression was the focused, intense look of a man who had decided on his path and was acting on it with total conviction. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the cameras. He simply watched Claire with a protective intensity that kept her grounded, reminding her that she was not alone in this fight against a man who had tried to take everything she held dear. He had simply shown up that morning at 4:30 to drive her to the city. She had not asked him to. Marge had given him coffee in a thermos and kissed Claire on the cheek, saying, "Call me the second it is done." The courtroom was packed. Danny was sitting at the opposing table, looking immaculate, with his high-priced legal team arranged around him in expensive, tailored suits. He looked up the moment Claire entered, his eyes scanning her with that familiar, predatory look that used to make her feel small. But today, it did nothing but harden her resolve. She walked to her table, sat down, and prepared to face the man who had spent months trying to destroy her character while maintaining a facade of total innocence for everyone to see. He managed to muster a look of wounded concern that she could see from across the room was meant specifically for the judge, Judge Eleanor Price, a woman in her 60s who had been on the family court bench for 22 years. Looked back with an expression that suggested she had seen every single performance there was to see. Danny's attorney opened with the prepared case, abandonment, erratic behavior, and testimonies. He spun a narrative that felt like a work of fiction, painting Claire as a woman who had lost her grip on reality. He relied on the same tired tropes, hoping that the judge would buy into his version of the truth, unaware that the foundations of his entire strategy were about to collapse under the weight of the new evidence they were prepared to present. The opposing attorney droned on about Claire being unfit for primary care, pointing to that Vermont incident where he claimed she lost consciousness, painting it as a sign of instability. He was trying to frame her as someone fragile and incapable of raising a child. Diane didn't even argue. She just stood up, calm as could be, and played the audio from Claire's phone from the morning Danny showed up at the diner. It was the absolute turning point for the whole trial. As the audio filled the room, the silence was deafening. The judge leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she listened to the cold, calculating tone of the man sitting just feet away from her. And it was clear that the tide of the entire trial had turned in that single damning moment. We listened as his voice shifted from that charming, warm tone he used for the locals to something terrifyingly cold and precise. He told her the restraining order was not finalized, using the word technically like a blade to cut through her nerves. Judge Price sat there, face unreadable, taking it all in. Diane looked at him and said, "Your Honor, this case is not about Claire Hartwell's stability or her mental state." She paused, letting the statement sink in before continuing her argument. She was painting a picture of a man who was not only manipulative but dangerous, someone who used the law as a weapon to silence those he deemed inconvenient. She was doing it with a level of precision that left Danny's legal team struggling to find a way to regain control of the room. This case is about a documented, long-term pattern of behavior by Daniel Hartwell toward the women in his life. We have evidence of financial misconduct totaling nearly $1 million. We have recordings demonstrating emotional coercion that will shock this court. And we have a witness. She paused, letting the silence grow heavy in the room. We have his mother. Even Danny seemed to flinch at that, his usual composure cracking right around the eyes as the reality of his mother's betrayal finally hit him. The courtroom erupted in a low murmur of shock, and Claire watched as the mask of the devoted, wounded husband finally began to slip, revealing the true nature of the man who had spent so long hiding behind a wall of carefully cultivated lies. Sandra Hartwell took the stand, dressed in a muted gray suit, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She answered Diane's questions with a voice that was measured and incredibly clear. She told them everything she had witnessed during Danny's first marriage. She spoke of the letters, the hidden threats, and a conversation she overheard years ago where Danny taught a friend how to document a wife's behavior, specifically to use it against her later in court. Her testimony was a devastating blow, dismantling the entire facade he had built. She was not just testifying against her son. She was witnessing to the truth, and her words were like nails in the coffin of Danny's case. leaving him with nowhere left to turn as the judge listened with growing, obvious disapproval. Then came Jennifer Marsh. Under Diane's relentless cross-examination, the truth finally emerged. Just 3 weeks before Jennifer signed that affidavit, a consulting fee of $40,000 had been wired from a company owned by Daniel Hartwell into an account linked to Jennifer Marsh Limited Liability Company. It was the smoking gun. Jennifer's carefully constructed mask of professional composure completely shattered right there on the stand. She had been bought, and the realization was visible to everyone in the room. The paper trail was undeniable. A simple transaction that tied Danny directly to the fabrications that were meant to destroy Claire's life. And it turned the entire courtroom against him in an instant as the evidence was presented for all to see. She stammered, asking twice to speak with her own lawyer before finally breaking down and recanting her entire characterization of Claire as unstable. Her voice was just a whisper now. Danny's legal team immediately begged for a recess. Out in the hallway, Danny marched toward Claire with his team trailing behind, his face fixed into a mask of false reasonableness, trying to play the victim one last time before the judge. He was sweating, his eyes darting around as he realized that the game was up. The confidence he had radiated when he walked in was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, panicked energy as he realized that he could no longer silence the people who knew exactly who he was and what he was truly capable of doing to others. He looked at her, his voice smooth, and said, "Claire, we can still settle this today. Same terms, let's not do this to each other." Connor immediately stepped to Claire's left. A silent guardian, Claire looked at Danny Hartwell, really looked at him in a way she hadn't allowed herself in 11 years. She didn't soften her gaze. She didn't make herself smaller. She just stood her ground and looked him directly in the eye. She felt a profound sense of relief, realizing that she had finally broken free from his influence. There was no fear left, only a clear understanding of the man who had wasted so much of her life. She stood there, strong and ready to finish this, knowing that her future was no longer his to control or manipulate. She looked at him with the cold, piercing clarity of a woman who had spent 14 months crafting a legal case that was entirely bulletproof and 6 grueling weeks hiding out in the quiet hills of Vermont, remembering exactly who she had become during that exile. She squared her shoulders and stated, "The only terms I am willing to discuss are already clearly outlined in our legal filing. Danny." She turned her back on him completely and walked with purpose back into the courtroom. Judge Price took 40 minutes to deliberate, but when the ruling came, it was an absolute and total victory for Claire in every sense. She was granted full custody of the child. A permanent restraining order was put into effect, and the divorce was finalized on the specific grounds of adultery and emotional abuse, with all those painful details officially entered into the public record just as she had demanded. The financial documents were immediately handed over to federal authorities for a comprehensive investigation. Judge Price went on the record, explicitly noting that Danny's behavior was a systematic and calculated campaign designed to destroy his wife's credibility, her finances, and her personal autonomy. Standing outside the courthouse, the November sleet was falling in a frigid, gray curtain, much like it had that dark night she first drove north on Route 93. It felt as if the universe was finally closing a difficult loop, with everything at last coming full circle. Connor was waiting for her at the bottom of the stone steps, holding an umbrella with the slightly awkward, uncertain posture of a man who rarely had cause to carry one. She reached him, and he held it over them both, shielding her from the rain as he asked, "Are you truly ready to go home now?" She took a moment to think about what the concept of home actually meant to her now. It was not just a place on a map. It was the cozy room above the diner, the red vinyl stool at the counter, the soothing sound of the cardinal on the fence, and the crisp, clean smell of fresh pie and pine needles in the Vermont winter. She looked at him and said, "Yes, let us go." They were exactly 40 minutes south of Burlington when she suddenly gripped the door handle and said, "Connor, I think my water just broke." A long, heavy beat of silence hung in the air inside the truck. He looked at her, his expression tight, then immediately back to the road. he said in the truck. "I am so sorry." But then he corrected himself, saying, "Okay," he was already reaching for his phone, already picking up speed, completely calm and steady in that professional way he used to handle fire scenes. "Okay, Burlington General is 22 minutes away. You do not have to do this alone." "Claire," he kept his eyes locked on the road, laser-focused. "Stop finishing that sentence," she told him, her voice strained but firm. "I am here with you. That is all there is to it." She breathed deeply through the rising pain, trying to find a rhythm. The sleet was hammering down against the metal roof, but his hands on the wheel were rock steady. She thought back to the woman she had been 11 years ago, the one who married a man just for status and who spent years shrinking herself to fit into a life that was never actually hers. She realized that woman she used to be had also been smart enough to make 14 months of careful, quiet notes to hide a memory stick in a drawer, and to know deep down that she deserved a much better life than she had settled for. She had finally listened to her own inner voice. That was the whole secret to her survival. The glowing lights of Burlington started to appear through the driving sleet. "Almost there," Connor said, his voice reassuringly firm and calm. "I know," she said, leaning her head back against the seat. "I know we can make it." Grace Ellen Hartwell was born at 8:43 p.m. on a Thursday in November at Burlington General Hospital. The attending nurse said she had an emphatic, healthy cry. She had Claire's eyes and dark hair, and from the very first minute of her life, she gripped onto whatever she could reach with a strength that surprised everyone in the delivery room. She was a little fighter, just like her mother. Marge showed up at the hospital around 11 p.m. carrying 3 different pies in a large bag. She said she did not know what the situation called for, so she brought options for everyone. There was apple cheddar, blueberry, and something she called a victory pie, which was coconut cream with a slightly wild, toasted meringue topping. That was just Marge being Marge, always knowing exactly how to make a high-stress moment feel a little more human and a little less sterile. Connor was already there, having been waiting since 8:15. He walked in right when Marge arrived, wearing a borrowed jacket that did not quite fit his broad shoulders. He held baby Grace with the careful, practiced gentleness of a man who builds things and knows exactly how much pressure is needed. He whispered, "She is absolutely perfect." Marge leaned over his shoulder and said, "She looks just like her mother. Strong face on this one." Connor did not look up from the baby. He just said, "Yes, she does." Claire watched them from the hospital bed, feeling a wave of relief. Her daughter was safe in Connor's arms. Marge was already cutting pie on the windowsill tray because she had brought a pie server as if it were a standard tool for a hospital visit. The sleet tapped against the windows, but the room felt warm and filled with soft light. Grace was making tiny, curious sounds at the edge of sleep. Claire thought, "This is what I was working toward all this time." It was not about this specific room or these exact people, but a life that finally felt solid and real. Something where you could put your full weight on it and know it would hold you up. Spring came early to the town of Mill Haven that year. The tulips in the window boxes were already blooming by late March, and Marge started her garden seedlings in the back room of the shop. Connor built a raised garden bed in the yard behind the shop. He claimed it was for vegetables, but Marge joked that it was just a transparent excuse to spend more time nearby. The federal investigation into Daniel Hartwell's business dealings finally hit a milestone in April with a formal plea agreement. He was hit with reduced charges, heavy financial penalties, and mandatory community service. It was a start, at least. His name was officially on the public record in connection with his schemes, exactly as Claire had demanded. Patricia, his first wife, had called Claire back in February. They talked for 2 hours. Claire later told Diane that the call was both devastating and necessary, and she advised Patricia to find a good lawyer in her own state to challenge certain parts of that restrictive non-disclosure agreement she had signed years ago under extreme pressure. Diane just smiled and said, "I can recommend someone excellent for that kind of fight." Claire officially passed the Vermont bar exam in March. Her very first case was a referral from a women's shelter network. A woman had called from a gas station in New Hampshire with no plan. No destination and just a bag in her car. Claire did not hesitate. She drove to meet her herself, ready to offer the help she once desperately needed. She was setting up a small family law practice with an office on Main Street in Mill Haven, just 2 doors down from Marge's pie shop. The sign in the window was modest, reading simply Hartwell Law. One morning in May, she was at her desk sorting through files while Grace slept in a small carrier that Marge had rigged up to the office door handle with a bungee cord, calling it her custom reception system for the little ones. Through the front window, Claire watched Connor across the street at the hardware store. He was talking to someone, gesturing toward a building project with the relaxed confidence of a man who knew his craft. His carpentry business was booming, and he had a long waiting list of clients. He glanced up, saw her in the window, and raised a hand in that slow, unhurried way that was so uniquely his. It made her smile to see him. She raised her hand back to him. There was no drama, no soaring music, no movie-style ending. Just two people who had found each other in the dark at a gas station and had chosen, day after day, to show up for each other in small, quiet and meaningful ways. That evening, she sat in the back garden with her journal while Grace slept against her chest in the carrier, feeling a profound and lasting sense of peace. The cardinal was back on the fence. Marge was singing to her seedlings through the open window. Inside the building, she could hear the steady, comforting sound of Connor working on his latest project. She opened her journal to a blank page and started to write. She wrote, "I used to think strength meant never breaking. Now I know that true strength means knowing exactly what you are willing to break for. I broke for Grace. I broke for the woman I was before I learned to make myself smaller just to keep the peace. I broke for every version of myself that sat in the dark, thinking I deserve more than this." She paused for a long moment, looking out at the garden. Then she wrote, "The USB drive is in Grace's memory box now. It is a reminder of where we came from, but not where we are going now." I sat there staring at the small, cluttered collection of items that told the story of a lifetime. A thin plastic hospital bracelet, a dried flower plucked from Marge's vibrant window box, and a faded photograph of the four of us crowded into that tiny, bustling pie shop on Thanksgiving. I remember Marge in her apron, flower on her cheek, and Connor holding little Grace, who was fast asleep against his shoulder. When I look at my own expression in that picture now, I recognize it clearly. It is the look of someone who cannot quite believe their own luck, or perhaps cannot believe how much their life has changed in such a short amount of time. She gazed up at the wide, darkening sky over the Vermont mountains. With a steady hand, she began to write a message meant for that woman on Route 93, driving north through the biting snow with no real plan, just a desperate need to escape. The words were simple, but carried the weight of liberation. "You are allowed to leave," she wrote. "You are allowed to take every bit of evidence you spent a year quietly collecting. Walk right out that door, and never look back. You do not have to wait until things get worse. You do not have to endure more pain just to prove you have suffered enough. There is no requirement to earn the right to begin your life all over again." She glanced down at Grace's peaceful, sleeping face, marveling at the strength in those tiny, delicate hands. She continued writing, her pen moving with purpose across the page. "Your instinct is not just simple anxiety. It is vital information. Your persistent discomfort is not a character flaw. It is your intelligence working exactly as it should. The life that it was waiting for you on the other side of the hardest, most terrifying decision you will ever have to make is not a consolation prize. It is yours to claim, yours to hold, and yours to build from the ground up. No matter how daunting that first step might feel to you right now, that life is the actual thing, the real thing, the one you were always supposed to be living all along." She closed the journal with a soft, final click. Nearby, a cardinal took flight, circled the garden, and then returned to its perch. Marge was still humming to herself, talking to her seedlings as if they were old friends who understood her every word. Connor appeared in the back doorway holding 2 steaming mugs of tea, wearing that slight uncertainty he always carried about interrupting. as if he were worried his presence might break the stillness of the moment. She smiled up at him, her eyes bright and welcoming, and whispered, "Come sit with me. There is plenty of space here for both of us to just breathe and be quiet." He moved toward her and sat down on the garden bench, careful not to wake little Grace. She leaned her head just slightly against his shoulder, finding comfort in his steady, quiet presence. He did not say anything at all. He simply handed her the tea, and they sat together in the gentle May evening. The light shifted slowly from gold to a soft, bruised pink and finally into the deep, particular blue that only happens in Vermont during the transition to summer. From somewhere inside the house, the sound of Marge's voice drifted out through the open window, breaking the quiet with a hum of activity that felt perfectly in tune with the world outside. The air was cool now, carrying the scent of damp earth and coming blooms, signaling that change was in the wind. "Connor, I need you to move those seedling trays before you get too comfortable out there," Marge called out from the kitchen. Connor didn't even bother to raise his voice as he replied, "I am perfectly comfortable right here. I can hear you just fine, Marge, and I honestly do not care about the trays right now." Connor stood up unhurried and calm and headed inside. He was back in exactly 4 minutes. Looking unbothered as he sat down again, he looked at her and said, "The seedlings are moved. It was done." Just like that, without any unnecessary fuss or long-winded explanations. That was the kind of person he was: reliable, steady, and entirely free of the noise that seemed to complicate everyone else's existence in this quiet little corner of the world. Claire looked up and said, "Thank you for moving the seedlings. Someone really had to do it, I suppose." She smiled, and he simply nodded. He did not need to say anything else. Sometimes, the quiet understanding between two people is worth more than 1,000 words spoken in haste. 2 months later, a young woman walked into Marge's pie and coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon. Her eyes were red from crying, and her hands were visibly shaking as she gripped her coat. She was carrying only one bag, looking like someone who had traveled a very long way to find a place where she could finally rest her heavy heart. She looked around the shop, hesitant, as if she were not quite sure if this world would allow her to finally stop running and find a home. She had seen the small sign in the window advertising a room for rent. Marge looked over at Claire, who was busy at the counter with a file. Claire set the file down immediately, sensing the importance of this specific moment. She pulled out a chair and said, "Sit down, dear. Let me get you some coffee. Fair warning, the pie here is genuinely exceptional." She set a steaming mug on the counter with care and added, "And you do not have to explain anything tonight. You are safe here, and we have nowhere else to be." There was a kindness in her voice, a gentle insistence that stripped away the young woman's defenses and allowed her to finally exhale. The shop, warm and filled with the scent of cinnamon and baking dough, seemed to wrap around her like a blanket. "Just have to sit here and be warm for a while." The young woman sat down slowly, wrapping both hands around the mug as if the heat were the only thing keeping her grounded to the earth. Her shoulders dropped just a fraction of an inch, the way shoulders finally release when they have been held rigid against the world for a long time. There is something about a quiet room that tells a person they are allowed to let go. Marge appeared from the back room, sized up the situation instantly, and looked from the young woman to Claire. She saw the story written in the woman's weary expression, a history of hardship that was clearly etched into the lines of her face, and she knew exactly how to treat a soul that had been weathered by too many cold nights. She said, "I will go cut some fresh pie." Outside, the town of Millhaven went about its typical evening routine. The hardware store was closing up for the night, lights flicking off one by one. The cardinal remained on the fence, a splash of color in the fading light. Connor's truck pulled into the alleyway with a low rumble. The light over the mountains was fading into a soft, golden hue, the way good things often happen in this life, without any unnecessary drama, and without a single loud announcement. The small bell above the door chimed, marking the start of a new chapter for someone who really needed it. It was a simple transition, but in that small town, it felt like the beginning of something truly significant for the stranger at the counter. Grace, who was strapped to Claire's chest in a soft carrier, suddenly opened her eyes. She looked directly at the young woman with that pure, fearless attention that only babies possess, as if she were saying, "I see you. You are here." That is enough to begin with. That is more than enough for anyone. Editorial disclaimer. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment, emotional reflection, and storytelling purposes. We hope these words brought you a moment of peace and perspective in your day. The intention is always to provide a brief escape, a reminder that human connection is a powerful force that can mend even the most fractured hearts, provided we are willing to open ourselves up to the kindness of others around us. All characters, names, locations, and events described in this story are entirely fictional and are not intended to represent any real individuals or situations. We strive to craft narratives that touch the heart and inspire kindness. If any element of this story resonates deeply with your own personal experience and you feel you need professional guidance or support, please reach out to a trusted counselor or local resource in your area. You are never truly alone. Seeking help is always a sign of incredible strength. Remember that your story is not over, and there are always people who are willing to listen if you only reach out to find the support you deserve during your own difficult moments in life. Stay strong and keep moving forward.